Welcome to another episode of our sailing adventure aboard Marcelina. In the last episode, Joe and I spent a week in Quebec City, resting and tackling a couple of repairs, before heading downriver and across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. We encountered smoke from the Canadian wildfires, as well as visitors from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We had some rough conditions before tucking into a marina by a small fishing village at the eastern tip of Prince Edward Island. Well, Surrey was nice, and yes, I was saying it wrong before. Surrey, not Souris. But after spending a week in this quaint little town, whatever you call it, we were anxious to move on. We had been monitoring the wind from the direction of the Canso Canal, which we needed to sail through to reach the Atlantic. But the promised wind shift to a favorable direction always seemed a couple of days away. Finally, on July 2nd, when the 10-day forecast still showed no signs of better winds, we decided to take our lumps and sail into the headwinds. Fortunately, the wind stayed under 20 knots, which made the seas reasonable and minimized our suffering. We also found quite a favorable shift along the north shore of Cape Breton Island that made reaching the Canso Channel somewhat less challenging. The evening of the 2nd, we reached a small inlet at the north end of the Canso Channel and made our way through the eerie darkness to drop the hook shortly before midnight. The next morning, we left the inlet and used the full width of the channel to tack about 5 miles upwind to the Canso locks. These locks only adjust for the tidal difference on either side, and so they have a rise or fall of at most a few meters. In our case, it was only about a meter drop, and we didn't even need to tie up. Just hold our position in the locks and motor out the other side once the gates and swing bridge open up. Initially, we were going to anchor behind an island just beyond the channel, but decided to beat against the 5 to 15 knots of southerly to get to Cape Canso, a cluster of small, rocky islands bordering the open Atlantic. Again, creeping in just before midnight in darkness and fog, we squeezed between barely discernible channel markers and low-lying knolls of rock and grass, silhouetted by a few lights along the shore. Actually, the original plan was to tie up at the Canso Yacht Club in the channel and do our final provisioning for the Atlantic crossing. But that obviously didn't happen. And, as I mentioned in the previous video, we decided that a crossing this year wasn't in the cards, and that we would instead head back west toward the coast of Maine. You may have noticed that I took the "around the world" wording off the title of this video. After a lot of thought, I decided to make a rather radical change. Not to regroup for another crossing attempt next year, but to drop the round the world goal entirely. Yes, I wasn't completely confident that Joe and I had enough experience, and yes, we still had some minor boat issues. But the main reason for dropping the larger goal was the experience just felt empty to me. Instead of enjoying the journey and the destinations, I found myself focused on getting to the next port so that I could get home to be with my family again. The journey became a chore, and the reward was getting to be with the very people that I had left behind. I just couldn't imagine repeating this sense of emptiness to attempt another crossing next year, much less a full 3-year circumnavigation. So, as per our revised plan, we left Cape Canso, entered the North Atlantic, and turned southwest to make our way along the 200 miles of Nova Scotia coastline toward Maine. Still battling the prevailing southwest headwinds, we worked against the 10 to 15 knot winds all day on July 4th. July 5th dawned with light and variable conditions, which further slowed our progress. A glance at the weather radar on my computer showed a large, menacing cloud formation heading our way. We motored into a protected area behind Linscombe Island just in time for the rain to hit. There was very little wind with the system, however, which, had I known, I wouldn't have sought shelter in the first place. We only stayed in the anchorage an hour or two, during which the anchor dragged a few times from the tidal current. This was the first time the anchor hadn't set properly during the entire trip. We only stayed long enough for the rain to pass, and then headed out into the light conditions again. Finally, through the afternoon, evening, and into the next morning, we had a moderate north to northwest breeze, and we could sail on a nice straight beam reach about 20 miles offshore toward our rounding of the Hawk at the southwest tip of Nova Scotia. But the favorable conditions didn't last, and by the afternoon of the 6th, the wind first disappeared and then filled in at about 10 to 15 knots from the southwest. So we beat south again, taking us perhaps 75 miles or so offshore. By midday on the 7th, we tacked back toward the Hawk in 11 knots and clear blue skies. We rounded the southwest tip of Nova Scotia on the 8th, with the wind turning through 180 degrees, flattening the seas and letting us fly the spinnaker in 5 to 13 knots off the stern quarter. Having been to the Bar Harbor area of Maine previously, Joe suggested that we head in that direction. I picked Dysart's Marina as one of the few full-service marinas in the area. It's located just across Mount Desert Island from Bar Harbor and next to the beautiful Acadia National Park. As we started the 120-mile crossing of the Gulf of Maine, I wrote in the ship's log, quote, "Can't wait to get home," unquote. That's not to say we didn't have some magnificent sailing. We did. It's just that once I had decided to head back to my family, it was my singular focus. Winds remained light from astern, and we motored the last 20 miles through the wee hours and in the fog to hit our tide and daylight window. The tide in Maine, as in the Canadian Maritimes, is pretty significant, and we needed to arrive on the incoming tide. But I also wanted at least a little daylight to navigate through an unfamiliar mooring field and marina. That meant we needed to hit the harbor entrance between 3 and 3:30 a.m. to put us in the marina about 4 to 4:30 a.m. Just before making the entrance, right at 3 a.m., we encountered our first lobster pot float. It was still dark, so even with our deck lights on, we couldn't see the floats until we were right on top of them. There were a lot of them, all the way through the long harbor leading to the marina. We actually bumped a few of them, but my main concern was snagging my prop on the line that runs from the pot on the seafloor to the float at the surface. With essentially no wind, a disabled propeller would have meant that we were at the mercy of the current, near rocky shores, at night, in the fog. As if that wasn't enough stress, the mainsail jammed in the mast track and wouldn't come down. That wasn't an immediate problem, but if the wind came back up, it could give us problems controlling the boat or even damage the sail if it's left flapping like a flag. So I had Joe on the bow searching for an open mooring ball as we neared the marina. The plan was to tie to it, then let the boat face into whatever breeze there was, and then I could go aloft to get the sail down. I wasn't comforted when Joe turned to me and said, "What does a mooring ball look like?" Fortunately, we didn't follow our prop, and our timing was good enough that we had just enough daylight to find that elusive open mooring ball, which is, by the way, a big white round thing that floats and is tethered to the bottom. I had Joe hoist me up the mast, and I was able to get the sail down. Turns out that there was a screw that had cocked sideways in the mast track, and it was jamming up the sail slides. Anyway, the immediate problem was solved, and we just needed to wait a couple of hours for the marina to open so I could ask them where they wanted us to dock the boat. After a short rest, we docked the boat, and I almost immediately got a rental car for the drive home. Joe stayed with the boat to enjoy the area for a few days, and even had his partner, Ashley, come join him. So, like I said, for as long as I prepared for this journey, and as hard as I had worked to make it a possibility, I just didn't realize until we were many weeks into this that the separation would put such a heavy burden on both me and my family. I just couldn't justify such a high price for what is, arguably, just a selfish pursuit. So having scrapped the around the world idea, I'll seek adventures on a smaller scale, and most likely ones that include my loved ones instead of leaving them behind. That also means that I won't be needing a boat built for and equipped for crossing oceans. So while we contemplate the process of selling Marcelina, I've decided to use the indoor storage facilities at the marina to store the boat, at least until next spring. My wife returned with me to the boat recently to prepare it for storage. We stripped off the sails, canvas, booms, and other hardware and disconnected the mast wiring in preparation for unstepping the masts and putting the boat inside. We also cleaned out the inside and, most importantly, donated the hundreds of pounds of food meant to sustain an ocean crossing to a local food pantry. Joe is amazing. He really took to sailing the boat, and he never missed a shift on watch, even when the conditions were difficult. I feel bad that he arranged his life to help with this trip, so for that I can only say that I'm sorry that it didn't work out. A quick note, just before uploading this video, a broker I had contacted in Maine put together a draft listing for the boat. The actual listing may look slightly different when it goes up on various sites, but if you know anyone interested in Marcelina, they can contact Numa Marine for the latest details. But despite listing Marcelina for sale, I'm not giving up sailing. In fact, I'm heading to the Annapolis Boat Show in October to see what's on offer in the new sailboat market. So when I decide what the next sailing adventure will be, I'll be sure to share it with you. Thank you for watching and for sharing this journey with me, even though I did cut it short. I hope to see you again soon.